Well,
hello.
Hey, I'll just be another minute or so. I guess the man is also going to be late. So I have
okay.
So, I mean, I'm kind of okay with just jumping back into where we left off. I don't know if anybody's in a particular place they want to share until then.
I just wanted to point out the Active Inference Institute speaker today, who was, anyway, he was a neurophenomenology person. Kiverstein?
Yeah.
Yeah, Julian Kiverstein.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and yeah, I caught a lot of references that I thought that this group would appreciate.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that sounds good.
So that was cool, as well as some of the discussion that they had around about embodiment and about touch, and it relates me to something else that John Fox, who's the director of the neurosciences at Rochester, he had a person on his podcast or his YouTube thing. I forget the woman's name, but MIT researcher on touch, and was just talking about touch as opposed to as being something with an object and a subject, and some discussions as it related to neurophenomenology and Varela in particular.
Was it Nancy King, right? Probably not.
No, it's a Chinese woman. Really interesting backstory. He asked her how she got into neuroscience, and in particular came to the States, and she was like, well, I was in Tiananmen Square, and afterwards felt like I should probably leave the country. Like, oh, okay, that's a good reason. Yeah.
This was someone from Rochester who had like a YouTube series or something.
Yeah. So John Fox is the director of the, I want to say, the Del Monte Neuroscience Institute or something. I'm not sure why it's branded. Well, I guess that's somebody's last name and maybe not the fruit company. But anyway, he's the director there, and he and I were connected with Greg Simpson's lab. So that's how I know John. But the woman was from MIT, and Chinese name like Fan. I can get it right now.
Okay.
Because I dropped it into the Neurotech-X. It was a good discussion of touch as one of these areas. How does the brain perceive touch? Fan Wang.
Sure. Oh, I see.
And and also the Center for Bionics and the Perception of Pain came up as just as it relates to phantom limb, and certainly one of the topics that they kept returning to was the what do they call it, depersonalization that happens with torture, and again, just
I see that he does stuff with like autism and other related things too, and I'd be really curious.
Oh yeah, sure.
How all that ties in the sense of even like basically low grade torture as in trauma and the depersonalizing effect it has on the body and how that screws up a lot of it.
Oh yeah. Sure. Yeah. That doesn't. That would be interesting. I think you'd probably want somebody more psychiatry. but looking at adverse childhood experiences and their long-term effects. I mean, he might touch that, but he is definitely coming this from a neuroscience perspective.
Okay, we'll check that out. Maybe cover that one later. Any other updates before we dive back into the land of biology of cognition in the 1970s? Okay. So, yeah, I mean, just to kind of recap, the only thing you missed yesterday, Amanda, was we kind of just took a step back and tried to sort of, I don't know, recapture what's going on. Like, you have the introduction here with designating the problem, and the problem specifically as cognition as a function, cognition as a process, which are basically the next two parts of what he's trying to do. And because we were, at least for myself, it was pretty useful to think about it in the sense of, wow, it's been almost a month that we've been kind of thinking about this, but not doing the paper necessarily. So yes, part 3 is related to part 2 in that sense. It's the observer, the living system, the evolution, and the cognitive. There's one other thing I'm missing here. The observer, the living system, evolution, and the cognitive process, as it were, is part of the cognitive function in general, part 3, and then the cognitive function in particular, which I guess is a little bit more, it looks to be directly about like nerve cells and some of the hardware and the functioning of those things. And you get to see the representation, and that's sort of like, that's half the paper. The other half of the paper is quite a lot of detail in this part, and then coming back around to the observer. But anyway, we were just finishing up the evolution part, and I was having a bunch of feelings about systems of changes and actions, and I forgot, what did we say? There was a few things we said last time too. I don't know. Is there anything else that I'm missing from last time that people want to say before we dive in? I can't quite recall. So the end of the evolution part was basically Maturana saying there's no significance in terms of where did this one start? The manner of which living systems is compounded, the interaction, blah, blah, blah. Is of no significance. What evolves is always the unit of interactions defined by the way it maintains its identity. The evolution of living systems is the evolution of the niches of the units of interactions defined by their self-referencing circular organizations, hence the evolution of cognitive domains. And there are a lot of talks about like, okay, is this sort of coding for affordances? Bradley had I wanted to go back. I didn't have time to. Bradley had sort of a nice sort of discussion about how Maturana is thinking about biology perhaps a little bit differently.
Yeah, I would like to hear a little more about that too, if you don't mind. I'm not familiar. E.O. Wilson, that rings a bell, but I'm not very familiar with what you were contrasting Maturana with.
Oh, yeah. So what I was talking about was how he kind of thinks of like the vertical sort of model of organization, and so you go from like genes to cells to there was this example with the social insects, the bee colony, where you go from cells to bees to the behaviors of the bees, and of course, sociobiology is about like social insects, but they also go down to like genes, and they try to build. E.O. Wilson tries to build a theory going from one up to the other. So I thought that was an interesting and apt comparison. Yeah, so there was this book in 1975, Sociobiology: The New Synthesis, and I don't know how it's aged. I mean, I guess it was pretty controversial at the time, in terms of like and it wasn't really had not very much to do with cybernetics, but I thought that was interesting how Maturana thinks about that sort of relationship one way. He thinks about it in terms of cybernetics. So you have sort of like this first order feedback system at the cells, second order feedback system at the level of the organism, and then a third order feedback at the level of like the social process of whatever the bees are doing in the hive or whatever. And so that's an interesting way to like connect those things, but it doesn't really square away a lot with, and nor does really sociobiology necessarily square away a lot with how we think of these vertical processes or vertical organization in, like, say, modern neuroscience, where we have people working on like systems, we have people working on cells, we have people working on molecular neuroscience, and it's kind of like it's the idea is that there's this sort of there's a reductionism, but there's also I don't know how much unity there is, but I'm not sure that what Maturana is talking about is necessarily the same thing. Or I don't know if it's necessarily even compatible in some ways with what people are thinking about, say, either in modern neuroscience in that vertical organization, or in like something like sociobiology, where there's a very clear vertical imperative. But it's I think there's almost like a different mental model of what that process is, and I don't really have an answer as to what. I mean, that would be something to think about more, but that's what I was getting at there.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, he certainly received I think undue criticism for his he was definitely pushing evolution into areas that people had not wanted or had not gone before.
Yeah.
and but he did that with this incredible ethology background,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I think anyway, I mean, I've got that book somewhere, and I've tried to read it, and it just doesn't seem that controversial.
Yeah.
like if anything, it's just like, oh, this goes to but in terms of like I feel like a lot of the debates about there's still a lot of debates about the selfish gene. You know what I mean?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of like at what level, like how much agency does a gene have? In that kind of Dawkins way.
Yeah.
What wasn't like there's some didn't like Dawkins regret the title, and that it was supposed to be more like the infinite, the perpetual gene or something. And I feel like I wonder how that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if he regretted it, but he definitely. I mean, I'd like to go back and I think it was I think he was on Star Talk, or he was being interviewed by Neil deGrasse Tyson, and they talked a little bit about that. But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a certain anthropomorphism.
Maybe, yeah. But I mean, I was just thinking about the what was we put this into bioevolution, like rethinking the gene doctrine.
Yeah.
Kind of, and how that's very that's very modern to be reconsidering that in terms of again, he was writing. This was like 75, wasn't it? Like,
Right.
Search about it? Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
what was that paper called? Anyway, and Quanta, it was funny because Quanta magazine just had a new article out on altruism, like the evolution of altruism,
Yeah.
which again seems to be this recurring, population genetics problem of how do you get it with this genetic evolution?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's Hamilton's rule, but is Hamilton's rule sufficient to explain?
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess we'll continue here. This is still part 3, cognitive function in general, and I'm guessing this is basically his higher level discussions, and then in particular we'll get down to some more nuts and bolts, neurons and glial cells. Yeah. So the cognitive process. I highlighted a few things over here. Basically, this talk about pure relations comes up, and I just keep hearing the title of Fuchs's book about the brain as a relational organism or organ, and not necessarily fitting, but some questions there. So a cognitive system is a system whose organization defines a domain of interactions, which connection, relevance, and maintenance of itself, and the process of cognition is the actual inductive acting or behaving in this domain. Let me change this here for a second. Living systems are cognitive systems, and as a process is a process of cognition. This statement is valid for organisms, regardless of nervous systems. So cognitive interaction means the internal state is changed in a manner relevant to its maintenance and enters a new interaction without loss of its identity. Yes.
So certainly that was a great, Michael Levin statement there.
Yeah, I keep exactly like I keep feeling like
yeah.
where
Did he? How he tweets like these book chapter, these book tables of contents. Like, is this a book that he's seen?
He must have. Like,
Okay, yeah, it does. Hearing that sentence, it's like you must have.
Right, like he just sort of has his copy of like Maturana's work on biology of cognition. He just references on the side of all like my his computer for sure.
I'll quickly search his feed.
Yeah, it's really been like that's the whole. I might try to reserve that talk for later because I know if I go into it now I'll take forever, but I feel like that's kind of where I wanted to go with Fuchs and then eventually Levin, because it's like you kind of see these, is Levin kind of trying to circle back and really push some of this stuff or pull it out, or I don't know. The nervous system enlarges the domain of interactions of the organism by making its internal states also modifiable, relevant in a relevant manner by pure relations. Now when I see this, I think of pure imagination in the realm of pure imagination. Not only by physical events, the observer sees the sensors of animals, cat modified by light, phototaxis, regular vehicles, and the animal cat is modified by the visible entity. The sensors change, absorption, leading to the nervous system expands the cognitive domain of the living system by making possible interactions with pure relations. It does not create cognition. Any thoughts about 1 through 2 so far? And then he qualifies it by saying, it expands the domain of interactions by bringing the domain of actions from pure relations. The functions of the nervous system is subservient to the necessary circularity of the living organization. The nervous system, by expanding the domain of interactions, transform the unit of interactions, which is a term from earlier in the book text, and is subjected acting and interacting in the domain of pure relations to the process of evolution. As a consequence, organisms include a subset of possible interactions with their own internal states, as if they were independent entities, generating the apparent paradox of including their cognitive domain within their cognitive domain. In us, this paradox is what we call abstract thinking, another expansion of the cognitive domain. So is that sort of getting into, I think it's maybe too much to say extended cognition, but we're kind of, he's sort of getting at these, embodied and other things that would come later on. I forget when the 4Es fully came in, but obviously we're after this. Expansion of cognitive domain, pure relations, means non-physical interactions between organisms. Basis for communication, the orienting behavior becomes a representation of the interactions. I think it's the first time, well, maybe one of the first times he starts getting into what that might be. There's a whole section later, I know. But this process generates another paradox. Organisms generate their own representations in their own interactions by specifying entities with which they interact as if they belong to an independent domain, while as a representation, they only map their own interactions. In us, this paradox is resolved simultaneously in two ways. Part A is we become the observers, and interacting with several representations simultaneously, we generate with the representations of which they can interact and repeat this process recursively, thus remaining as a domain of interactions always larger than that of representation, although some regulator theorems, perhaps. We become self-conscious through self-observation by making descriptions of ourselves representations. And interacting with our descriptions, we can describe ourselves, describing ourselves in the recursive process.
I have a question about 2, and it seems, go up to the top of this page. Yeah, let me see where I should start here, because it seems a little weird to me, and it seems like he's like kind of skirting around like what goes on in the brain by like kind of building a model. Okay, so let's see. In an organism without a nervous system or its functional equivalent, so that would be like a cell or like a paramecium or something. So it would be like non-neuronal cognition or something like that. Its interactions are of a chemical and physical nature. A molecule absorbed and an enzymatic process is initiated, so it's like the path from like a receptor down into the nucleus. So there's some sort of cascade that's being triggered. A photon is captured and a step in photosynthesis is carried out. That's a process. So it's largely a physiochemical process. For such an organism, the relations holding between the physical events remain outside its domain of interactions. I'm not sure I follow that, but let's put that aside for now. So I guess it means that it's not interacting with something else, like some other organism, or it's so the nervous system enlarges the domain of interactions of the organism by making its internal states also modifiable in a relevant manner. So that's like I don't know. He talks about internal states. I guess they're like physiological states, but I'm not sure what that means. So I guess that if you make your, I don't know what they're talking about, what he's talking about with respect to interaction. Is he talking about interaction with like light, or is he talking about interaction with something else? I'm not really sure what he's getting. It's like kind of like he's using this very general language. Yeah. And then, so not only by physical events, the observer sees that the sensors of an animal, say a cat are modified by light. So now you have this organism with a nervous system. The sensors of an animal, like a cat, are modified by light. The cat sees something, and that the animal, the cat, is modified by a visible entity, say a bird. So I guess a bird would like come in the view of a cat. There would be light that would make the cat visible, and then and then the sensors change through physical interactions. The absorptional light quanta, the animal is modified through its interactions with the relations that hold between the activated sensors that absorb the light quanta at the sensory surface. The nervous system expands the cognitive domain of the living system, making possible interactions. It does not create cognition. So I'm just trying to work my way through that mentally, like what he's getting at. I mean, I guess that's a model of perception and action, because if you don't have a cat there, if you just see light, there's nothing to act upon. But if there is a cat, then you see, then you can act upon it. Of course, if you imagine a cat there, you can also act upon it. Or if you like, there are actions that can be taken without anything there, like a phototaxis in a plant. So a plant can move towards light without anything else, just the photostimulus. Or a Bradenberg vehicle would move towards a light source. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. Kind of what I can see his model, but I'm not quite sure I understand. I mean, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that, anyone? Or?
I just said in the chat, like, I'd be really, I'm not quite sure what to make of states. Like, I have sort of like ways I could make states make sense to me, but I don't know what he means it by states. Like I mentioned the EGRT stuff here, and like, okay, I get that, but I'm kind of extrapolating from my sense of what classical cybernetics would make that to be. And is it a physiological state? Is it? I would appreciate like a little crisper relation to, like, there's some really cool stuff here about domains of interactions that are kind of appealing to me in this sense. But like cognitive domains and niches and like what I feel like I'm sure Maturana like does explicitly state all this in some of his work somewhere. It's just not here, because like niche and the relation of metabolism, there's a living system defined through its domain of interactions. Okay, but like I don't know what, and I'm curious. I guess I'm just curious what level it's at, and like I understand this is right. This is the general high level discussion of things, and maybe I haven't really unearthed enough of what's in the next section to know, but maybe we'll find out. But yeah, I have a lot of those are where my questions are, and also like I don't really know what pure relations means yet. Does any like what does that basically mean? Like getting to a state that's maybe not totally embodied, but just sort of like the mathematics of relations that's in sort of an abstract sense that connects to things? Or is it more of a cybernetical framing out, right, in an ecological psychology or cybernetics sense? I don't really know.
My impression was that it was that pure relations are what's allowed by like abstraction, and like the perceiving of differences between things. Like if the nervous system somehow allows a richer cognition than just reaction to external stimuli, like part of that is that it allows a kind of categorization and recognition of objects, and being able to perceive differences between things. But yeah, there's a lot of gaps in this.
Do you think it's a stretch to say pure relations is essentially like omniscient affordances? Like if all the affordances were known and available, or is that too far?
I don't think it's that closely connected to
Okay.
affordances.
It's more like just ways of relating.
I think maybe one example would be our perceived difference between like two colors. That would be a pure relation. And that's like a really simple version. So like that kind of thing would be necessary for affordances, but it's more.
Okay, well that reminds me of like my most cited Norbert Wiener quote then about transmission of information is impossible save for as a transmission of alternatives.
Yeah.
So it's not like the alternatives existing at all. Or being, or is it more, I don't know if I want to even say the word being able to be perceived or like manipulated.
Well, yeah, that sounds
Yeah.
like psychophysics. I mean, as opposed to like a decision making or something like that. So I guess it would be like peer relations in that sense. Might be like you don't necessarily act upon it, but you're influenced by it. So if there's like a bird on a background, you'll see the bird, you'll see the background, and you can tell the difference. That triggers maybe action, but something like decision making on it isn't a pure relation. I don't know. Yeah, it's like another one of these cases where a glossary would be good. Only because it's just
representations later is helpful.
Yeah.
Also, I saw yeah, okay. So basically, what I'm saying is, I saw Amanda post stuff about autopoiesis, and I kind of looked at the timeline. I really like to. I think Maturana is sort of helping me. I'm actually really glad we're looking at this now because I'm kind of getting this. I kind of did a little really bad drawing up here of this like timeline, and it's like I get from this perspective. I can do this. Nope, gotta use this here. I get from this perspective kind of this space between here and even like let's say 50 and just like Norbert. Okay, like I'm kind of aware of this, and then there's sort of I think what was it? Whoops, where did my thing go? Sorry. So yeah, autopoiesis was 80. 80 was auto. Okay, this is really awkward to draw this. And then 87 was this Tree of Knowledge book, and I don't but it's Maturana and Varela. It's Biological Roots of Human Understanding, and I feel like I can kind of extrapolate a bit there, but I feel like I'm kind of getting this section a little bit more because it ties in quite a bit here to me. But then it's sort of like what happened here too, and I feel like we're going that way. And I would be potential future readings might be the autopoiesis book, which is about here, and I think Amanda put that in the slide. So, okay, this out of the way again. Yeah. I don't know if anyone wants to sort of. I can continue sort of taking the lead here, but if anybody wants to read this section, they can do that too. Otherwise, I'll kind of proceed through a bit slowly because I'm not as familiar with this stuff. It starts to talk about the neuron, the anatomical units, and then metabolic and genetic units. Anatomically, and it's a little bigger. Anatomically and functionally, a neuron is formed by a collector area. It goes into dendrites, axons, and so on. Capable of conducting propagated spikes. The functional state of the collector area depends both on internal state and on the state of activity of the effector area synapsing it. Correspondingly, the states of activity of the effector area depends on the train impulses generated to corresponding collector area. presynaptic and non-synaptic interactions with distributive elements and other effectors that take place in the neuropill and then immediate vicinity of the negative collector areas. This is true even in the case of the Amargreen cells.
Amacrine.
Yeah. And he talks about bifurcating axons are inflated with impulses. As a result, the pattern of effector activity, that is, the branch of pattern invasion within a train of impulses determines the branches of distribution elements of effector area of neuron, depends on the spike internal distribution, okay, which determines expulsive. And this was part, looks like this is part 2 of part 1, but I don't see the part 1. On non-synaptic influences in which form local water and ion movements. Okay. At any moment, the state of activity of neurocell represented by the pattern of impulses traveling along distributive element, function spatio-temporal configuration of its input. It is known that in many neurons, the recurrence of a given afferent spatio-temporal configuration result in the recurrence of the same state of activity independently of the way in which such spatio-temporal configuration is generated. And he's citing this over here somewhere. This is so in the understanding that two states of activity in a given cell are the same equivalent if they belong to the same class of, oops, let's not do that. The same if they belong to the same class as defined by the pattern of impulses that they generate, and not because they are a one-to-one mapping of each other. Spatio-temporal configuration of the input to a neuron that causes recurrence in a given state of activity is a class of afferent inferences defined by a pattern of the relations holding between the active afferents and the collector. A given class of responses is elicited by a given class of afferent influences. Okay. Any comments on the first 5 paragraphs so far?
I guess I appreciated the detailed description, but I didn't get far enough into this section to like know exactly where he was going with it. Like I haven't seen yet how this allows pure relations. But I did appreciate the type of description that this is giving of neurons.
I think he's kind of getting at like a distributed system here. So he's kind of talking about the unit. And actually, like the neuron isn't the anatomical unit. So okay, that's like maybe a unit of interaction if you had one neuron doing something with something in the environment, or maybe another neuron. And then you have this larger system, this network. So you have these collectors, so you have things coming into any one neuron. And then 3, you have this pattern of branch invasion, so you have this network topology. 4, you have distributive aspects. So, you're kind of figuring out the equivalences of different parts, different relations that come from these interactions. And then talk about how this is a deterministic process, the transfer function. So you need a transfer function when you have this collector of different things coming into a single neuron. So, and then every cell is doing this at once. So you basically built this network from a single unit, and they're all units, and then those units are going to interact with the outside world. And I guess that's what he's kind of getting at here. He's trying to build up this model of nervous system. I mean, which is good, because all too often we don't really. I guess we have it with connectionism, and keep in mind that connectionism, it wouldn't come for another decade, where they really kind of said, "This is connectionism. This is like you have a system that can be sort of highly distributed, can be process information as this interconnected system. You can put data into it, etc. That would come in like in the 80s. So we're like 10 to 15 years behind that, and he's talking about these networks that are going to do things as maybe its own unit of interaction or a bunch of units of interaction.
So we continue with 5. At any moment, it transfers function as its collector area to a well-defined deterministic process. Yep. Genesis and participation of the generation activity of other neurons. In both cases, the interactions between neurons are strictly deterministic. He talks about inhibition and excitation. I don't know if people want to mention specific things there, you can. Non-synaptic interactions take place between neighboring elements, which can cause each other the relative local movements, water and ions. Something singular may happen during synaptic concomitances that are collector areas if the synapses also affect each other non-synaptically. Thus, the neurofilm may have to be seen as constituting a plastic. A plastic system through which acquired self-addressing of states of activity attain their functional significance as become specified by non-synaptic and synaptic concomitances of the interactions of the organism. It is not the representation of the same state of activity which causes neuronal changes of behavior and significance subordinated to the evolving domain of interactions of the organism, but rather it is the occurrence of local concomitant states of activity produced by seemingly unrelated interactions which cause such subordinate changes in the reactive capacity of neurons. Section 8 appears to have 4 subsections. It follows that one should expect a significant number of neurons which may vary in different classes of animals, a continuous change in their transfer functions or in the circumstances that are activated as a result of the past history of the organism. However, for the understanding of the functional organization of the nervous system, it is necessary to consider that nerve cells respond at any moment with a definite transfer functions to classes of afferent spatiotemporal configurations in their input, generating definite states of effector activity and not to particular afferent states. So maybe let's review this for my sense, because I'm reading this a bit quickly and I don't quite understand what it's saying, but basically definite to classes of afferent spatiotemporal configurations generating definite states of effector activity and not to particular afferent states. What is the not to particular afferent states referencing? I think I missed something here.
Is that kind of like a generalization, as just trying to say it's not, when you think of like an image of a cat, it's not a specific image of a cat. It's images that have catness, and that there's also a prototype
Platonic
cat. Well, it's funny because of course this person's writing in very early days of cognitive science, so they're just kind of missing
the language.
But I think it would what does other people think?
Yeah, I think it's like so it's a mean field model of what a neural network does. It's like a neuron if you take like a cat and you show it a cat, right? It takes in the cat image, but there's all this parallel processing that goes on. So its output isn't going to represent that single unity of perception. It's going to represent the features that are important to the network, but it's mean across all the cells. So it's like it's averaged out as this catness property. So that's what neural networks do. That's what connectionism was good at, or is good at, is like extracting those features. And so that's why, like, we have these really good, like, sort of generalization properties of simple images like a cat. We can say, well, it can identify a cat with different backgrounds or different colors or shapes, or, that sort of thing.
It's kind of funny that he mentioned cat specifically in that sense. Okay, yeah, that thank you. Any interaction is represented, furthermore, any interaction represented by the nervous system by the sequence of states relative to neuronal activity leading to the conduct which it generates. This conduct should be repeatable to the extent that the interaction sequence of states is reproducible, that is, as long as it's the historical transformation of the nervous system, learning does not make it impossible. Learning. B, the nervous system always functions in the present and can only be understood as a system functioning in the present. The present is the time interval necessary for an interaction to take place. Past and future and time exist only for the observer. Although many nerve cells may change continuously, their mode of operation and their past history can explain to the observer how their present mode of operation was reached, but not how it is realized now, or what the present participation in the determinative behavior is. C, any behavior is defined through the sequence of states in the receptor surfaces, external, internal, that satisfy direct or indirect subordination of the maintenance of the basic circularity of the living system. Since the nervous system is continuously changing through experience, what occurs when the observer sees a given behavior reenacted is a sequence of interactions. A sequence of interactions that satisfy this subordination independently of neuronal process which generate them. The more complex domain of an organism, of interactions of an organism, the more indirect the subordination, but not the less strict. Hello, Michael Levin. Like, this feels like some stuff there. And then D, D, and then a concluding paragraph to 8. D, an organism is a unit to the extent that its conduct results in the maintenance of its basic circularity, hence identity, and two modes of conduct are equivalent if they satisfy the same class of requirements for its maintenance. For this reason, the organism is self-regulated homeostatic organization does not require a constant behavior in its deterministic component elements, neurons, if their changes become specified through the generation of conduct, and sameness of the conduct is defined with respect to an observer or function that must be satisfied. So he concludes section 8 with saying, thus, at any moment, every neuron functions deterministically within a definite transfer function and generates a definite pattern of activity in the effector area, transfer function, pattern of activity, blah, 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 blah. Okay. May change from another moment to another. Organism will still give rise to what the observer would call, quote unquote, the same behavior. The converse is also the case, and though the observer would call it different behaviors, the organism may satisfy this subordination to the same aspect of maintenance in the basic circularity. So, is this Maturana basically trying to be a little more explicit about? I don't even know what to say, but 8 was interesting. We're almost at the end of the nerve cells section of the discussion of the particulars. 9 says, from these notions, it's apparent that neurons cannot be considered as the functional unit of the nervous system. No neuron can have a fixed functional role in the generation of conduct, for it must be continuously changing its participation in it. For the same reason, a fixed collection of cells also cannot be considered as the functional unit. Only the conduct itself can be considered the functional unit of the nervous system. If nerve cells respond to classes of afferent configurations and not to particular afferent states, they must necessarily be treated as equivalent parts of afferent configurations. Okay. So any further thoughts about the nerve cell discussion?
I thought it was an interesting argument for, I guess what we could call like functionalism. It was interesting that it was like an argument based off of how neurons work. I feel like I haven't seen that before. This also made me think of the way Fuchs talks about the right like level of explanation for a person's behavior not being the brain, not being neural processes. Like that's a mechanism, that's part of the story, but that's not the best explanation. I think the reasons, what Maturana talks about here can be seen as reasons for that. That the brain level description it's incomplete. It doesn't fully describe behavior.
Of the same vein, but a little bit further out. I don't know, far outness. I don't think Maturana himself, I can maybe ask. There's a very particular. I don't think Maturana was influenced by Buddhism per se. I think that's more Varela, who was, his student, even though Varela passed away before Maturana. I'm really curious to check out Maturana's later works. Like I tried to find some of his some of his last works describing maybe how he thought, like reflecting on things. I would like to find those. But I mentioned Buddhism here because I could see how describing things in this way would be very appealing to some of, like even in. I'll show this because it's easy for me to do. Even in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, if you go, we're looking at like Chan, like Chinese Buddhism and ethics. There's actually Varela cited here, and it is sort of there's a kind of a congruence in terms of function. Like it's about relating freely. It's not about following a specific dogma. It's about sort of I could see there being kind of an appealing similarity of some of the ways of talking about things and like what is sort of the gender part or not. And it's really interesting to tie that into like how does that mesh with what we've sort of become modern and like dovetailing into connectionism or neural networks too, and because it's not quite the same, but it's sort of where does it go? Let's see. Oh, it's already 8 o'clock. Goodness. Jeez. It's funny because it feels like I just moved like 1, 2 chunks of pages. But that's man, it's a lot. There's a lot here. I guess any concluding thoughts as the hour hits the top? I don't know if I guess we could. I guess one thing I can say, I don't know if we want to go super in depth into everything here. If people are okay with the pacing of this, because there's going to be a lot of deeper talk about things. I definitely would like to go to the observer. I would like to see memory and observing. But like, I don't know, people want to try to skip some of these things. Ahead
Let's
or
try for next time, for next Wednesday, to maybe get to the next section, the next like main section, and that would be a lot. And we don't have to talk about every line. Obviously, we wouldn't have time for that. But maybe I'll try to read to part 5, and then pick out the most interesting things. And if we end up jumping around, that's fine with me.
Okay, I think that's a very good idea. So for next time, let's continue with read through, basically finish 4, which starts on page 5, and then get to get to 18, which is where part 5 problems come in with those problems. So that's quite a big chunk, but I think it'll be good to maybe try to pull away from stuff. I'm really curious. I'm really curious about representation. I'm really curious about observer. I'm really curious about memory and learning.
Yeah, I'm interested in how memory and learning relates to the 11 stuff we've talked about in the Cybernetics reading group.
I think that'll be a really fun thing. Also, like bonus points if you want to have some discussion in the Slack about like where do you see 11's like relation to all this stuff. But okay. That's a pretty solid task for next time, but let's aim for that. And then, oh, that's right. There's still the noon meeting tomorrow for some other things.
Yeah.
I'll try to put
I won't be able to be there. But.
That's not mandatory. It's more just things I want to talk about and read some other paper stuff.
Okay.
But yeah, I'll be here for that. And thanks everybody for tonight. Good stuff. I'll talk to you next time.
All right.
Take care.
Take care. Thank you.